A very warm welcome to Professor Evelyn Tribble from the University of Connecticut. Professor Tribble is Professor of English and Associate Dean for Humanities and Undergraduate Affairs at UConn, and has published widely on topics relating to Shakespeare, performance, memory, and skill. And today we are going to be hearing about the genius of the system, cognitive ecologies, embodied practices, and early modern playing. And it'll be about an hour's presentation, and then we will have questions at the end, or possibly also partway through, depending on how it goes. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily, for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to announce that I am no longer the Associate Dean for Humanities and Undergraduate Affairs, and I'm back to being faculty and teaching and research. So that's actually good news for me. Let's see. I need to share my. I'm going to share my screen. Is that? Let's see if we can get that working. Here we go. Okay. Great. Um, Yeah, again, th thanks very much, Emily, and thank you for coming. I'm going to my title actually comes from a well-known book about the Hollywood studio system by Thomas Schatz, which is famous for its repudiation of auteur theory, which was very common at the time he was writing, and his emphasis on the nature of the system itself. I may return to this at the end if I have a chance. Um, I've gotten interested in sort of thinking about conditions of group creativity, conditions that allow kind of individual and group talent to flourish, that supports new or younger talent, produces both extraordinary peaks, lots of dross, and so forth. But that's going to be more or less a coda at the end of this, I hope. So the talk itself, I'm going to do sort of three different things. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about um, what I mean by cognitive ecologies and the way I've been using that, looking at a couple of examples from early modern playing, as well as some contemporary examples. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about gesture. I'd be really interested in those of you in music about your expertise on this particular topic, but I'm going to talk about gesture in terms of the early modern playing system, especially Christopher Marlowe. And then I'm going to talk about another aspect of Shakespeare's theater that I've been interested in for quite a number of years, which is the way Shakespeare wrote for boys and the way he kind of integrated the particular talents of younger actors into into his plays, particularly Merry Wives of Windsor, which I argue shows examples of instances of revising a part for a small boy. And then, as I said, as a kind of coda, I want to think a little bit about group creativity. Um, so and if anybody has questions as I go, please feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand or something. Happy to talk as we go. But also we'll be leaving lots of time for questions and comments. This is a um, quotation I really like from Peggy Phelan. What are the forms of writing that will allow us to hold the moving body? The moving body is always fading from our eyes. Historical bodies and bodies moving on the stage fascinate us because they fade. So I think is thinking about embodying history and trying to think about historical performance practices is can be fraught but also fascinating. And I also want to start with a quotation from one of my co-authors, John Sutton. I've been working with him for a while, and Karen Perlman, who write that remembering, sensing, construction, and decision making are hybrid practices involving not just subjective and neural systems, but also bodily material and social resources, embodied, collaborative, worldly, and practitive cognitive systems. Um, and they argue that this kind of systemic ecological view, sorry, um, does not debunk or efface the aesthetic role of individuals in creative processes or downplay the originality of work produced in unique cultural contexts. So I'm quite interested in this relationship between system and sort of particularities, and how those kind of dynamics work. So I'm going to talk first about this kind of idea of the a cognitive ecosystem, which is a term I've been working on for a while. And this framework, I should say first that This is developed out of work I've been doing with John Sutton over the years, so some of this comes from him as well. Um, so just some background on the on this framework. It arises from ultimately from movements both within and without the mainstream cognitive sciences over the last 40 or 50 years, broadly allied with what's called 4E cognition. And that concept, which is becoming really important in philosophy, groups a range of kind of overlapping views in which our mental life is embodied rather than restricted to the brain alone, embedded in rich material and socio-cultural technical settings, enacted in histories of flexible engagement with the environment, and sometimes extended across non-biological or cultural resources outside the body, which might then become integrated into hybrid cognitive systems. So thinking, feeling, and remembering can be forms of distributed cognition that sometimes span brain, body, and world. And one question that we try to think about is, why should we keep this term cognitive? Because it's obviously freighted with, or can be freighted with, kind of technocratic or neurocentric kind of brain-bound associations. But I've been aiming to kind of reclaim and expand that term to mean not just things that happen in the head, but thinking in kind of rich and dynamic coordination with emotions, with the built and natural environment, and the social world. So thinking is acting, remembering, imagining, dreaming, gesturing, making, moving, grieving, forgetting, narrating. And these are all doing verbs that remind us that thinking is multiple, embedded, and extended. That is kind of ecological. So cognition as such is thought about fully from the start as not only embodied and emotional, but deeply embedded in the cultural and material environments that change across history and context. So we reject this. If you look at the cognitive psychological literature, sometimes that's very individualistic and done in these very abstracted settings, such as laboratories. Um, and so we reject that form of kind of individualism, but also we also want to think about how to think about the mind in a system where we're really thinking about kind of the body, environment, and how we can think about mental life in all its richness and complexity without either cutting off minds in kind of a private, subjective realm or just seeing them as nothing but brain processes. So, um, and the sort of um, our working definition is think about a cognitive ecosystem as a kind of interconnected system or assemblage of neural, bodily, social, and material mechanisms and resources which mesh in mutually dependent ways as people engage in flexible, more or less intelligent activities. So that a complex activity such as, I'm sorry, early modern playing needs to be understood across the entire system, which includes psychological mechanisms underpinning the task dynamics, how attention, perception, and memory are managed by players and audiences, the physical environment, including conventions for structuring and employing space, relationship between playing and audience space, cognitive artifacts in the period I'm working on, parts, plots, playbooks, technologies, sound and lighting, and social systems that underpin the company, mechanisms for enskillment and training. Um, sorry, excuse me a minute. Okay. Um, So my work on the subject began, a number of years ago now, and thinking about memory. At first, I wrote some things that are just sort of more or less on the way that memory is kind of construed in the plays. But as my research developed, I started to think more about, how does memory, attention, how do these things actually function across the kind of playing system? Um, and as I'm sure most of you know, Shakespeare's company handled what seemed to be like a crushing workload of up to especially in the 1590s, of performing possibly up to 6 different plays a week, little available time for formal rehearsal as we think of it today, no directors as we know them, um, no built sets being relatively uncommon, except perhaps at court, boys playing all female roles. And in reading about this, I noticed that some theater historians kind of used a deficit model to think about it and suggest that if they're doing this work this quickly, they must be relying on stock gestures, routine conventions that allow kind of mechanistic sort of good enough functioning. Um, and then alternatively, individualist models would kind of single out Shakespeare as someone whose genius kind of transcended those kind of ordinary constraints. So my approach kind of rejects both that kind of conventional stock and individualist model and looks at the complex interactions between or among the material, social, somatic, and affective elements of the whole system. And examples that I've used are thinking, this has been something that's been gained a lot of attention in the last couple of decades, is, for instance, the way that Shakespeare's company seems to relied on parts, which you can see here. This is one of the very few examples we have. This is Edward Allen's part for Orlando. So he got only his own part and the cues. Um, the plots. There are a few of these survive, but they seem to have been they're kind of about the size of A3 pieces of paper that seem to have been used as kind of covers for the playbook. And they provide a sort of outline of the action. So each line that you see there underneath is sort of a particular scene, and they're kind of coded and very terse examples of, what's supposed to happen here. For instance, you can see about two-thirds of the way down in the first column, alarum with excursion. So essentially, that's what stands in for fight choreography. It's like here's how you're going to make like a battle. And so it developed certain levels of skill and practice that the actors had. They were almost always skilled swordsmen. Was just called upon in a way um, to meet the demands of any particular kind of performance. Um, and of course, modern theater, sorry, the other thing is, of course, the way the stage can be kind of mapped on sort of the physical aspects of the stage get kind of easily mapped onto the fictional demands of a particular play. And of course, if we think about it, modern theater, of course, has its own set of material artifacts, props, plans, and systems and conventions, such as the table reading that you see here, um, highlighting. Some actors I remember being interviewed about using parts in a kind of, I think it was at the Globe, one of the experiments they were doing using cue scripts rather than the whole text. And the actor said, I had to highlight all of my lines, even though I had only my lines, because I can't memorize anything if it's not in yellow. So this sense of, how this is an example of, how an individual actor kind of uses that artifact, annotates it as part of a way of uh, seeing her way through that particular performance. Um, and then, of course, we have the need for coordination, and the sort of the technical rehearsals are almost notoriously terrible and fraught and tense, because it's the moment at which you have to pull everything together, the blocking, the lighting, and so forth. And so I think, this idea of the ecosystem isn't at all simply confined to a kind of historical practice. It also can work for any particular set of practices we might want to see. And that's gone kind of quickly through that. I don't know if there are any questions or comments before I go on to talking about gesture. Okay. Um, So one of the things I got interested in was the role of gesture. That seemed like it was often treated as example A of how they just had to use these kind of formalized conventional stock routines as a way of kind of getting through things. So that gesture, if you especially if you read kind of earlier theater history, gesture is almost always seen as this just this kind of outmoded, old-fashioned practice that people used to get through the crushing demands of their of the system itself. So gestures, it's often seen as a kind of old-fashioned, outmoded practice designed to kind of gloss over a lack of preparation, like a stock routine. But I think taking gesture seriously as an embodied artistic practice in this period gives us a very different picture. And I've been thinking lately about this in connection, not just with Shakespeare, but with Christopher Marlowe, especially Tamburlaine. So this quote from, sorry, here it is. This quote from Thomas Heywood, I think really captures this idea. By a full and significant action of the body, the actor charms our attention. Sit in a full theater and you will think you see so many lines drawn from the circumference of so many ears, whilst the actor is in the center. And then later, so bewitching a thing is lively and well-spirited action that it hath power to new mold the hearts of the spectators and fashion them to the shape of any noble and notable attempt. So in this context, the excellent actor commands attention, figured as a kind of power akin to magic, gesture and movement. So action was seen as the hands, but also the entire body, the way you move. The full and significant action of the body can rivet an audience and tether them to the player. So Heywood's idea of the string kind of holding the audience's attention on the actor himself and on the gestures captures the sense of almost a quasi magical link here. And I think these accounts illuminate one of the most salient features of the play Tamburlaine, because Tamburlaine has this uncanny ability to conquer through the force of the magnetic attraction he exerts on others. Of course, there's a lot of death and destruction and blood, and especially in the second one, but the first one's kind of notable for the relative absence of that. So I think a major component of this is what the excellent actor describes as a full and significant action of body. So, and here I'm relying in part on Joseph Roach's fantastic book, The Player's Passion, Studies in the Science of Acting, which of course goes, both from our period up into the 19th century and beyond. Redders, he writes, saw the body of the actor fallen into a passion as brimming over with emotions in need of channeling into properly regulated conduits. A passion, once unleashed, he writes, cannot be suppressed, but it can be shaped into outwardly expressive forms. An oratorical gesture, a prescribed pattern of action, serves as a pre-existing mold into which this molten passion can be poured. So the sense of the passions and of gesture as being both kind of quasi-magical and potentially kind of dangerous is something that really marks the way the gesture is seen in this period. Both supporters and detractors of the theater imagine this kind of quasi-physical link between the movement of the actors' bodies and the eyes of the audience. And that link is given weight and heft through the attraction of animal spirits as they flowed through the body of the actor into the spectator. So action is a kind of term of art in this period, encompassing, as I mentioned, not only hand movements, but also the embodiment itself, yoking a hand, mind, and body to theatrical and audience space. And this power was ascribed in particular to Edward Allen, the famous actor who performed most of Marlowe's plays, of whom Thomas Nash famously remarked that neither Roscius nor Aesop could ever perform more in action. Sorry, let me move over to here. Yeah. Allen's striking physical size, his command of the stage, lingered in public memory, engendering both satirical and laudatory accounts of how much his performance literally resonated. Susan Sarasana quotes a poem recalling his Cutlux gait, a reference to his famous stamping across the stage and the effect the vocal and gestural effects he used had on the audience. His eyes are lightning, his words are thunder. Now, some theater historians have suggested that Allen's performances, for this reason, were seen as kind of old-fashioned in contrast to the putatively more natural style of someone like Richard Burbage. But these views perhaps reflect a kind of tendency to imagine his physicality as somehow working in opposition to the cognitive demands of muscling and stamping his way through the part. So in contrast, I would suggest that we can see his performance through the lens of kinesic intelligence, a yoking of the body and mind and environment through the power of gesture. Now, and I want to just pause here briefly and talk about some of the science of gesture. I don't want to, I can't, don't have time to do a full review of that, but just some examples of this. This is from Tim Ingalls' Whip Making, talks about hands are not instruments, operate remotely from a command and control center. Intelligence is not located in the brain, in the hand, or the body, but in the technical act, the gesture in which they are brought together. And this is some of the work that's been done on gesture. Um, Susan Golden Meadow and Sean Balick. Gesture affects thinking by grounding it in action. Hands help speakers to manage attention and memory. Gestures help to facilitate the link between the words a speaker utters and the world that those words map onto. Um, so researchers have shown that gesture grounds thought in action. It facilitates the link. Gesture is kind of constitutive of thought, and there's a tight link between mind and hand. Now, contemporary researchers on gesture focus on spontaneous co-speech gestures, the sort that I'm feeling a little um, exposed by doing right now. See, but the uh, they not on the art of gesture, but I think that there may be ways in which findings on gestures and embodied cognition may have relevance to the study of action as it was construed on the early modern stage. So early modern theorists such as John Bulwer, 1940 in 1944, Chirologia, argued that the gestural arts build on natural abilities and propensities. So we may naturally gesticulate, but we can harness that natural tendency in a way that produces an art. So as with any embodied art, if you to master gesture, you have to move from a pre-noetic, that is something that's happening more or less spontaneously as you speak, to something that becomes lifted into conscious awareness. This is kind of thing everybody, people who dance, music, other kinds of forms of bodily training have to do, moving from the something that's kind of built into our system to something we become aware of, so that then we can perform in ways that mask that awareness to an audience. Um, so, most research on the cognitive science of gesture is focused on that spontaneous co-speech, but some work has begun to explore what's described as neurobodily distributed aesthetic entanglement, a characteristic of skilled professional performance embodying gesture. So there's a recent piece about a particular form of musical performance where the performers viewed their gestures as arriving spontaneously, but the researchers found that there was a lot of physical connection between gesturing and vocal production that are actually brought into harmony with their performance goals. Now, such aesthetic aims would have been familiar to a contemporary audience, and there's ample evidence that they appreciate it and were critical evaluators of the art of action. This is an example of the kind of screenshot of, and this is a screenshot of Bulwer's various examples of these meanings of gesture. And I think it's one reason the fact that we see them as this chart, it starts to look very rote. This is to supplicate, this is to pray, this is to desire. But it's capturing in two dimensions something that is actually happening in three dimensions. And there is evidence that the art of action was seen as something that could be appreciated, understood, even perhaps voted upon. So, sorry, there's a example of in the Henslow Allen archive, there's a letter to Edward Allen proposing that he pits himself against the actors William Bentley and John Nell in a test of acting skill. I see not how you can anyway hurt your credit by this action, for if you excel them, you will then be famous. If equal them, you win both the wager and the credit. If short of them, we must and will stay Ned Allen still. I find this a really fascinating moment to think about, how these tests might have happened, how they were evaluated, how it was, what kind of aesthetic criteria were used to decide, who has the better kind of acting skill. But the most important element does seem to be the way the art of action, Matt, is figured through the memory of that part into the actor's body and out onto the audience and having that kind of effect. So exactly how people imagine that it sort of reminds us that actors were kind of valued for this ability to grace their parts in the same in a similar way that we think about gracing in the musical kind of context. So the art of learning a part involved lifting it from the page through the actor's body and from thence to the audience. So players such as the excellent actor described above were admired for their near magical ability to transmute the words of the playwright into physical space and action. Um, in fact, one of the interesting things, as I mentioned about Tamburlaine, is that early on, there's not that much violence in on-stage combat. In fact, Tamburlaine says that instead of fighting in the second scene, we will play the orator, um, and that's dismissed as suitable for only cowards and faint-hearted runaways. But Tamburlaine overrules him and shows that his opponents are air and thinking about oratory as mere words. For him, oratory and action are are linked together. Oratory kind of is action. And just a couple of examples. Sorry. Um, if you Marlowe, of course, is very interested in these kind of vertical and horizontal kind of modes of action, thinking about Tamburlaine himself as being tall, lifting upwards and divine. So there's a kind of vertical axis. And then in the horizontal register, Tamburlaine brings into being the territory that will be conquered. Um, and that vertical register of gesture is kind of instantiating divine aspirations. And I just wanted to juxtapose one moment in Tamburlaine with a quote from, sorry, quote from Bulwer. Um, Tamburlaine says, "Forsake thy king, and do but join with me, and we will triumph over all the world. I hold the fates bound fast in iron chains, and with my hand turn fortune's wheels about. And sooner shall the sun fall from his spear than Tamburlaine be slain or overcome. Draw forth thy sword, thou mighty man at arms, intending but to raise my charmed skin, and Jove himself will stretch his hand from heaven to ward the blow and shield me safe from harm. See how he rains down heaps of gold and showers, as if he meant to give my soldiers pay." So you can see the kind of the bigness of this particular speech and the way that it kind of brings into being um, the greatness that Tamburlaine believes that he possesses. And sorry, I wanted to at one moment in Bulwer is makes really big point about the the way in which the natural embodiment needs to be focused through exercise. So he suggests that if you're trying to learn oratory, that you stand in front of a mirror or some kind of reflective device and just practice. So he says, use exercise, bend, and this is over on the right side, bend and rest your arm and hands to the right, to the left, and to every part, that having made them obedient unto you, upon the sudden and least signification of mind, you may show the glittering orbs of heaven and the gaping jaws of earth. So this sense that you are using your hands to practice these moments, so that and I think this gets at that question of the idea of kind of rote and stock conventions. You practice and practice and practice so that you make your body obedient to you, so that you can give the illusion that this is a sudden and on the least signification of mind, you can suddenly show. That is, you can turn this kind of learned skill into something that feels spontaneous and will actually harness the kind of energies that you've been sort of practicing. So, um, so I'm interested then in the way that the this statement kind of captures this sort of embodied kinesic intelligence of the speaker. So his hands, his gestures are not mere kind of rote repetition of pre-memorized action, which is the way that gestures often been talked about in this period, but they're developed through long and painful study and practice, so that just at the exact moment you need them, just when you need to bring that world into being on the stage, or in front of your auditors, they seem to arise like magic, entrancing and entraining offstage and onstage audiences alike. Okay, so that is so that's one example that I've been thinking about with kind of embodied histories is gesture. The other example that I've been looking at is the um, the apprentice system and Shakespeare's use of boys. Um, of course, one fact that all my students always seem to know about Shakespeare's theater is that the boys played the all the women's parts. Um, but critics and scholars have somewhat disagreed historically about the implications of this practice. Um, so some historians of the theater have assumed that boys would have struggled to give credible performances of complex adult female roles such as Lady Macbeth and Cleopatra, and that audiences would have been accustomed to making allowances for them. But I think there's a weight of counter evidence really clearly showing that contemporaries highly admired the emotional range and expertise of these boy actors. A spectator at the 1610 performance of Othello, for instance, wrote of the devastating effect of viewing the face of the actor playing the dead Desdemona, who entreated the pity of her spectators by her very countenance. So, but I think if we focus rather than on one particular individual, but think about the system that might have underpinned early modern performance, we can illuminate this apparent paradox. And here, an analogy from the work of the anthropologist Ed Hutchins can help. This is one of the books that really spurred me to work on this subject, cognition in the wild. Um, Hutchins, 1995. Hutchins argued that traditional models of human cognition create the impression that individual minds operate in isolation and encourage us to mistake the properties of complex socio-cultural systems for the properties of individual minds. But models of distributed cognition and cognitive ecology, in contrast, see them as embedded within a particular system and environment. So Hutchins focused on one environment, a naval vessel that integrated social, material, somatic, and technological systems. And one of the points that he made was to look at how inexperienced midshipmen managed to um, perform when they really didn't have a full knowledge of what they were doing. He argues that the physical and social configurations of the space aboard the vessel constrain and enable these aspiring officers to perform at a level of skill and expertise it would be impossible to achieve outside the structured, scaffolded context. And by analogy, if we look at early modern boy actors in isolation from this larger ecology, maybe their achievements might seem difficult to explain, but if we view them within the structures of the company, we can see that the conditions of early modern playing afforded young actors a kind of scaffolding that undergirded their development of their talents. So any boy, of course, who had experienced any formal schooling would have come to the company already highly adept at verbal memorization. That's what you did all day in school. Um, Boys were apprenticed to senior players who trained them up from a young age. And as I argue, parts for younger boys were written using a kind of scaffolding technique that allowed them to gain on-stage experience in relatively controlled situations. So little boys who were playing a messenger or something, and their cue is actually what they're supposed to do, rather than something they have to remember. Um, so thinking about the boys is through the lens of contemporary childhood might give us a skewed view of their capabilities and constraints and neglects their place in the larger system. So what I'm going to suggest here comes out of some work that I've been doing. I've been working on Merry Wives of Windsor, an edition of Merry Wives of Windsor for Arden. Um, and without going into too much detail, I'm working on the hypothesis that the quarto, which we see here, which was published first, and the folio, which we see here, represent distinct versions of the play. So I argue that Q is the Q, what the quarto is an incompletely transmitted version of the original play as it was performed during Elizabeth's era. And F represents a revision of that now lost text for a Jacobean performance. So the idea would be that there's another text that's kind of lying behind both of these, that the quarto is a somewhat incompletely transmitted version of the text that was originally performed, as you can see here, by before Her Majesty, that is under Elizabeth. But that F represents a deliberate revision of that material for a courtly context, particularly for the performance in 1604 before King James. So evidence for this is, I think, strongest in the two versions of the final act, but I'm not going to talk about that today so much as a sort of another more minor set of revisions that gives us a glimpse into the way that Shakespeare rethinks and revises roles for his young actor. So my focus is on the boy who is called Robin in the folio. In Q, the same boy remains unnamed and has a purely functional role. So just to contrast, these are the different ways that so you have to bear with me that I'm right about the folio being a revision, but if you so what I'm saying now is if that hypothesis is correct, and the quarto represents an earlier version that was then revised for the folio, we can sort of see how Shakespeare thinks about writing for boys, and particularly how he might be thinking about writing for a particularly talented child. So in scene 3 of the quarto, Falstaff is discussing his plot to send identical letters of wooing to two women, as Mistress Page and Mistress Ford. He tries to get his henchman, Pistol, and Nym to do it for him. They refuse, so he gives them to the boy, who's meant to take these letters, one to each woman. And he says, in scene 3 of the quarto, he says to this unnamed boy, "Here, Sarah, bear me these letters tightly. Sail like my pinnace to the golden shores. French thrift, you rogues, myself and skirted page," and they exit. A pinnace was like a tender, like a small boat that you would that you might take to land next to a larger boat, a sailboat. And so I think what we might see here is a skirted page. So he's wearing these a page outfit with these long flaps at the back. So Falstaff is kind of imagining him as being this tiny little sailing vessel next to this very large man who's right next to him. And this joke of like the great big fat guy and the little tiny player is something that we see in medieval theater. You see it in something like Love's Labour's Lost with Moth and Holofernes. It's kind of a really common sort of visual joke that we see in a number of different plays in this period. So in the folio, these lines are are pretty similar. But we start to see these changes as the folio goes on. So the boy, you see there are 4 scenes, in 2 of which there's no boy. But in scene 6 of the quarto, Falstaff just gives this is a very typical kind of direction that's given to a small boy who maybe doesn't have a lot of experience, right? You can see, boy, give her my purse. So the child on the stage doesn't have to do anything but do exactly what the actor tells him to do there in real time. He doesn't have to remember any lines. He's given, and I think these are roles that I describe as being kind of scaffolded roles. These roles where the boy, I mean, these boys would, if they'd been at school, they would be able to memorize well. But what you really need to learn is stage presence. How do how do you attend? How do you listen to what's being said? How do you stay in the moment? All of these kinds of things that take just actual practice of being on stage. And so there are a number of examples of small boys being coming on as attendants and being given direct orders by the senior actor that then they can carry out without much cognitive burden. They just have to they give them give me here's the purse, give it to her. It's pretty straightforward. Um, but in the folio, first of all, the boy ends up getting identified by name as little Robin, and his appearance and his precociousness are repeatedly emphasized. And this is, again, the precocious, small precocious boy is a type that Shakespeare uses a lot. In the tragedies, these cheeky little boys like York and Richard III or Macduff and Macbeth are doomed, right? You know, the cuter and more precocious they are, the more likely they are to die shortly. Um, but in F, another example, as I mentioned before, would be Moth in Love's Labour's Lost. But in F, Shakespeare seemed to revise this to look for opportunities to call attention to this boy, his appearance and his skills. So he's sandwiched into a number of scenes in Acts 2 or 3. So these scenes would have been, um, uh, they're not really necessary to the plot. So the scenes would have been kind of pre-existing, and this is just a place you can give the boy a little more to do. And that means that when you're revising, you don't necessarily have to, you're not changing the structure of the scenes too much. You're adding sandwiching some things in that are going to increase the amusement value, perhaps, for your audience, and use this boy who who is going to be very interesting and attractive to the audience. So in Q scene 6, there's a very simple he appears only to as his function role, give her my purse. But in 2-2, sorry. He gets a line. Um, that is when Mistress Quickly comes in, Robin comes on and announces, Sir, here's a woman would speak with you. And then he becomes the object of the plot itself. Mistress Quickly says, Mistress Page would desire you to send her your little page of all loves. Her husband has a marvelous infection to this little page. You must send her your page, no remedy. So this gets kind of integrated into the plot, and the boy becomes one of the enticements to the women to embrace Falstaff. Um, and yeah, so um, in scene 6 in the quarto, the mistress quickly simply enters. There's no real necessity from the point of view of plot to have somebody introduce her. Um, so he's further showcased in Acts 3:2 and 3:3, and these are scenes that give the small boy an opportunity for suggestive back chat. So 3:2 begins with the entrance of the little boy and the page. And Mistress Page says, Nay, nay, keep your way, little gallant. You were wont to be a follower, but now you are a leader. Whither had you rather, lead mine eyes, or I your master's heels? And he said, I had rather, forsooth, go before like a man than follow him like a dwarf. And Mistress Page says, Oh, you are flattering boy. Now I'll see you'll be a courtier. And Ford says, Where had you this pretty weathercock? So Shakespeare exploits the physicality and agility of this boy who breaks precedent by walking ahead of his new mistress rather than behind. And Mistress Page feeds him a straight line when she asks whether his preference is to lead or follow, and that allows him to make this kind of risque joke about going before like a man. Um, and so the boy's performance, appearance, and pertness is also commented on by Master Ford, who calls him this pretty weathercock. And again, in scene 3:3, um, this he's added to the comic centerpiece of the play, which is the buck basket scene when Falstaff is hidden in a basket of laundry, and ultimately like dumped into the Thames. So the quarter kind of shows we don't really need him. I mean, he doesn't need to be in there. We have a couple of servants who are doing the so-called heavy lifting of Falstaff already. And Q and F say roughly parallel. But then there's an inset piece that calls attention to the boy. How now, my little Eyas Musket? What's news with you, you little Jacqueline? Have you been true to us? And so both of these epithets are teasingly affectionate comments on his size and playfulness. An Musket is a young sparrowhawk, and that recalls the little Iases in Hamlet. And a jack-o'-lint is a puppet or an effigy, maybe like a piñata, that's set up as a target during Lent. And And the child is then later promised a new doublet and hose if he keeps his secret. Um, so he's given quite a number of lines and becomes semi-central to the plot. And so editors who think that the common belief is that the folio was first and the quarto is just a debased version of the folio. But and so if you believe that, you simply say, well, Q just omitted this, you don't really need it. So they're extravagantly unnecessary from the point of view of plot. The other thing that's omitted in the quarto is the Latin learning scene, which is also very unnecessary. And Emma Smith and Laurie McGuire, who've written recently on Merry Wives of Windsor and a kind of and the relationship between the folio and quarto, write that it is notable how often excuse me, um, sorry. It's notable how often critics describe the additional folio-only material in Merry Wives as having a detachable quality or irrelevant to the development of the action. Such censures, they argue, derive from an impoverished, even puritanical view of the presence of the theater, an assumption of that the message is more important than the medium. And they make this point about the Latin learning scene, which doesn't forward the action, but provides a kind of humorous interlude that showcases Evans and Mistress Quickly's salacious malapropisms. So the Robin scenes that I just talked about are also useless from a kind of reductive functionalist view of theater. But if they're seen as instead deliberate additions and expansions, we can gain a glimpse into some of Shakespeare's aims in revising. Throughout his canon, we see the kind of footsteps of particular young comic actors, the short, dark boy and the tall, blonde boy who tread through Midsummer and Merchant and As You Like It, as well as the talented, kinetically gifted small boy who plays Moth in Love's Labor's Lost. And so through the Robin scene, we can catch glimpses of the way that Shakespeare writes for an especially small, precocious boy capable of standing out among the chaos of the play, probably dressed extravagantly and likely of particular appeal for the courtly audience. This gets at the kind of larger argument I'm making about the play, which is that if we take Robert Dutton's suggestion that of this revision seriously, that we can get a glimpse of Shakespeare really thinking about what kinds of things are going to appeal to this particular audience and placing them in the play, and writing to both to the demands of the audience and to the abilities of his actors. Um, so just then as a coda, I kind of want to think a little. This is something I'd just like to put out there as something we can maybe talk about rather than something that I've actually finished in any um, uh, entire way. But I want to think about group creativity and the conditions that kind of nurture it. And I'd be really interested in hearing from you guys because you have these very specific things that you're studying, and what are the periods in which we have these moments. And as I mentioned before, one of the reasons that I wrote some of my earlier books was to think about interactions between individuals and systems. And then when system was discussed, it was couched often in negative terms such as conventions and rote and stock. And that Shakespeare was seen as transcending the ordinary routines and shticks that characterized his contemporaries. And I didn't see a lot of scholarship that accounted both for the extraordinary individual contributions of playwrights and actors and for what we might think of as the genius of the system. And that is Schatz in this book appropriates a term from the film theorist André Bazin and his attempt to contest the dominance of auteur theory in film criticism or the lionizing of the director as the individual creator. So I'm just starting to think a little bit about parallels between the Hollywood studio system from kind of the mid-1920s through the 40s. I'm teaching a course now on the Hollywood musical, so it's gotten me interested in thinking about how these operations were founded, nurtured, and created, and thinking about what are the conditions that afford a kind of a flourishing of new aesthetic forms within old systems, such as the entertainment industry. And so this approach, I think, emphasizes the multiplicity and heterogeneity of the interacting resources that can be involved in individual or social cognitive processes. And so These would include social interaction, techniques, practices, norms, strategies developed individually and collectively, artifacts, technologies, and device, each is with their own histories, formats, and dynamics, and environments, geographical, material, institutional, and architectural. Um, just one example to think about the environmental metaphor. I thought one interesting similarity between the rise of the professionalized theater scene in England in the 1580s and 90s and the early history of filmmaking and the early rise of the studios is that the terrain was less contested than other forms of practice. Um, for instance, the future studio moguls. That end up founding the studio system were all of them came from about a 500 square mile radius in Central Europe. They were almost all Jewish. And they were all recent immigrants. Some of them had immigrated as children to the U.S. Some of them were second generation. And as Jews, they were unable to pursue lucrative careers that were kind of open to the WASP elite. And so they started in the garment industry, or in the case of like Louis Mayer, who I'm not lionizing, by the way, he was a monster, but he starts out in the scrap trade up in British Columbia. Um, and so the new technology of film in this period was a nearly open terrain, despite attempts of people like Thomas Edison to clamp it down. That is, it wasn't already populated by existing structures and practices. And so, the Warners and others kind of begin, very simply by just, renting projection equipment. But one of the things you notice about them is that and finding cheap existing spaces, but that they were always thinking about the next thing. Moving to seeing where things were going and moving to the next. And so they were relatively unfettered by gatekeeping that would have marked the almost any other kind of career they could go into apart from the ones available mostly to Jewish immigrants. And I think they're interesting. And so they appropriate, modify, steal from existing kind of parallel industries such as vaudeville circuit and Broadway. And I think the early modern entertainment industry is an interesting parallel there because they do feature people, and like Shakespeare, for instance, who kind of capitalize on a system that's not yet fully ossified, that's not gate kept the same way that guilds in this period are gate kept. They use a similar kind of structure to the guilds, but they don't have these kind of barriers of entry. And you think about a young man like Shakespeare who is at the age of 21 has three small children and no family money. The opportunities to build something, a new form of kind of entertainment, professional, purpose-built sort of theaters, on the terrain of existing entertainment industry. Of course, they didn't invent playing. This is very much part of the system they grew up in. But thinking about these what the opportunities were kind of open and the way that they thought about talent resources and then thought ahead to the next new thing. The other thing I think is interesting is the relationship between competition and cooperation that you see in both kind of systems. And so this actually, to return then as I finish to Karen Perlman and John Sutton that I started with, thinking about group creativity. So the Malinan, they write calls for a new definition of creativity as situated practice, emerging through person-environment interactions, material, technological, as well as socio-cultural. They're and working on the director and editing. They say we aim to contribute to this emerging definition, so it doesn't take away from the strengths and valuations, but it clarifies actions of cognition and creativity. Creativity is distributed, which we can make in both critical and constructive modes, is that at least in the context of culturally embedded art forms such as film, dance, and music, these are embodied processes stretching across specific systems or ecologies of practice. These increasingly influential distributed approach to creativity falls out of broader situated and anti-individualist movements within the cognitive science. It can just be framed as a critique of residual individualism in thinking about the arts or the modernist romantic cult of genius. So that's me, and thank you very much for your patience, and I'd be very interested in any questions or comments you might have. And I will stop sharing so I can see you guys.
Thank you so much. It's a fascinating tour through I kind of different angles on this idea of cognitive ecologies and distributed cognition and the way that I say situated practice also, which is such a useful term, I think, and a way of thinking about this. Um, I might take the convener's privilege of kicking off the discussion myself, if that's all right. But I hope everyone will have lots of questions. I'll give you time to think about them while I go with one. I've got a page full of notes now. But it really struck me that one of the provocations of your work is, and what I found really helpful in my own context of 19th century music practice, is looking at the remaining traces of this practice, the material traces, the spaces, in our case the scores, the concert programs, the writings, and in those places where they don't seem to make sense to us. So, as with the early modern theatre, we have places where, for instance, there are no markings in the orchestral parts, whereas today orchestral players mark very uniformly what to do and follow it.
Right.
And that's sometimes been taken as an argument that, oh, well, they just didn't care, they weren't rehearsing properly, it therefore indicates a low standard, a low level of respect for the music, all these kinds of things, in the same way that you're referring to. And instead, I think this model challenges us to think, well, heck on, if something doesn't make sense in our context, then what was different? What ecological characteristics were needed for this material to make sense, and what skill base was it resting on that's different to ours? So I wonder, I mean, if anything around that you'd be interested in expanding on.
Yeah.
It's not exactly a question, it's more of a kind of
Yeah, that's a great provocation, and I think I'd love to hear more about, the period you're looking at. I mean, I do think, yeah, sometimes there's for instance, some of the research on playbooks, because there are when once a company decided to adopt a play, there were, I think, usually two copies of the playbook itself made, and they've been and one went off to be vetted by the master of the revels, and the other became kind of the book of the play. And we really don't have any of those. We've lost almost all of them. Um, but the ones that we have, um, people, critics are like, well, they think you call them prompt books, right? And so that's an interesting kind of back formation. I mean, prompting was in this period seemed to have been less about remembering your line. It's just pushing you on stage to kind of get you to, to be there, right? And so thinking about, if you look at modern prompt books, they're extensively annotated. You can the 19th and early 20th century and beyond, you can, see examples of this, that kind of outline every single action. Um, and early modern prompt books really don't do that. Both the plot and the book themselves seem to really be about anything that you've got to make happen that isn't in the dialogue might be there, but nobody's going to go and annotate exactly, what happens at every point. And they're designed really um, to be these kind of working documents for a group of people that are working often with with tacit assumptions about, what needs to be done, practices that are already kind of in place that just perhaps need a little jog, or the way that athletes will kind of, have a couple of little mottos in their heads about what they need to remember, to do, so that we can't expect them to be fully um, to be fully explained in the way that we wish they were. So that, yeah, sometimes, yeah, these are different kinds of practices. They might be tacit practices. They might be things that, everyone kind of already knew how to do, and therefore they don't have to write it down. Or just, representing different kinds of practices that aren't necessarily inferior, but are practices that don't leave traces that we wish that they wish they did. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's all around this idea, isn't it, of just because something isn't written down doesn't mean it wasn't important.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
sometimes actually it was the things that were in a way the most highly skilled things that weren't the ones that weren't written down because they didn't need to be.
that's right.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
I think that's right. Yeah.
So we have some questions coming in the chat. It'd be lovely if people are happy to ask them out loud. That'd be great. But I understand if you can't always. Kibria, would you like uh, to join us?
Yes, but I might lose network in between, so I'm sorry for that.
Okay.
Okay, I just wanted to say this was a really wonderful session. It made me think so much about my own project I'm working on, performance ecologies, Shakespeare adaptations in Indian theater. Um, what I found is that what I also typed is that the genius that we usually think it isn't in adaptation choices alone, but in the distributed practice that makes those gestures intelligible. And today's talk really helped me look into that.
Mhm.
And not just that, I think that it also made me rethink archival absence, like how much of what we call lost might actually be system level skill that doesn't leave textual residue. So yeah,
Yeah.
thank you for uh, if you would like to comment on that.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. That's really, I look, that sounds like a fascinating project. And yeah, I think that sense of, is something lost or is it simply a sort of a set of practices that we can only recover kind of indirectly? I think that's a really a good question. And and also the relationship between, what people, I think your point about making these gestures kind of intelligible is a really interesting one as audiences change. Something that we've all seen that the idea of the natural in theater is always kind of what people always define that against whatever practice just happened. And that's the unnatural, that's the sort of stock routine. And what we're doing now is what's really natural and important. You see that kind of over and over again in the way that historically performances are sort of understood as, this is something new and therefore the things that come before it get kind of denigrated into something that, needs to be kind of worked against. Um, but yeah, I think that's a really fascinating set of questions. And the other thing that I think has changed the way some of us are thinking about at least early modern systems is the development of the lost play databases. I don't know if you guys know that, but there's a database that's held now at the Folger that essentially tries to make the absences more apparent. That is, that there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lost plays, of plays that we only have the title of or references to. And the database tries to reconstruct as much as we know, which often but it isn't much. But it's a way of, I guess, making absence visible, which might be something that's a way of thinking about kind of performance practices.
Hilary, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, hello. Thank you, Ellen. That was wonderful. Very,
Yeah.
very interesting presentation. I deal with gesture two I'm beginning to in recitative performance,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
second recitative. And you spoke a little bit about memory and how perhaps the gesture also helped memorize the lines or the
Yep.
physicality is involved in memory. But I know that myself as a performer, when I'm playing pieces by heart, if I've only memorized it in my body, I will, in an emotional moment on stage, be likely to have a memory slip there. That I
Hmm.
actually have to have the bodily or physical memory very intimately related with the emotional and the intellectual
Yeah.
memory of the piece. And when
Hmm.
it's not complete, that could be a place where things go haywire. And I just wondered what your work related to memory, or if you could speak more to gesture and memory.
Oh, that's a great question. That's a really interesting observation about your own practice. I mean, I think if you think about the way, if you think about the parts that the early modern actors used, and the relationship, Joseph Roach's book on passion, right? That
Right.
the idea would be that as one of the things that people find kind of astonishing is it was probably relatively little group rehearsal. What was necessary, there probably was, but essentially you went home and you had your part and you remembered it. But one of the one of the ways of that Roach talks about of encoding that memory is through mapping the passions, right? So you're reading, so in this case, Edward Allen is reading Orlando, who goes through lots of passions. I mean,
Right.
there's one thing they loved in this period, it's madness. Really, so figuring out how to, and so one thing and I do this sometimes with my students, one thing that if you just take the part, and look at that in isolation from the rest of the book, it affords a sense of this kind of emotional trajectory of your character. So that, if you're the boy playing Ophelia, you're noticing that your first lines are all things like yes, sir, no, sir, 3 bags full, sir, that you're very much in this, inferior role. And then as you get to the end, you're like, whoa, this is great, some great stuff here, all the songs and the madness. And, you're sort of seeing at a glance almost that kind of trajectory as you move, through. And so I think the parts afford that sense of kind of an emotional, what we might call an emotional journey, and what they would probably call a sort of a sequence of passions. And those passions you would have particular ways, both
Right.
conventional, but also your own. Like, how do you make
Right.
those your own? So I would think that might be one of the things that's happening with the idea of these contests that Edward Allen is asked to participate in, is how well do you embody these so that it's not like you don't just remember, okay, I'm going to do this gesture here. You're sort of like, this is part of this very deeply embedded study of like these are the kinds of ways that you can express these sorts of passions. And so when I get to this moment, again with that Bulwer quote about using practice, right? You get to the moment and it feels like it's happening for the first time. So that would be, I mean, of course, I'm sure there's plenty of hack stuff where people just kind of put in the gestures to cover stuff up, but I think thinking about this physical action is kind of deeply connected to the memory of that as you encode the passions out of
Right.
from the language into your body and then out to your audience. That would be the way I think might be happening. The other thing we've noted that some of the research is more about how um, people actually remember things better when
Exactly.
there's gesturing.
Exactly.
The
It's
audience
a
remembers it. Yeah.
right. It's
Yeah.
and we do too. It's circular somehow.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
This kind of
yeah,
feedback loop. Right. Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Thanks. Thanks a lot.
That
Sure. Thank
reminds me
you.
of
Great
what
question.
that reminds me of what I don't know if you're familiar with Jed Wentz's work on Aaron Hill. Hillary is nodding, but
No, I'm not.
who I think it's Hill who talks about the mazy round where you call the passion to mind, and was it from the imagination to the eyes to the body, so you trigger the passion in your body by imagining it, or you can trigger the feeling of the passion by going to the gesture first. I like the
Right.
way around it works.
And Hill
um
also made his actors write the passion into the playbooks.
yeah,
He
exactly, yeah.
also
Oh,
as
okay.
well.
I
Yeah,
would
I
love
mean,
to read. I would love to read more about that if you could,
yeah, I can, yeah, I
send
can,
me
yeah,
that
yeah.
material. That sounds fantastic.
Yeah, it's quite a lot of those late 18th century acting and declamation books where the passion is listed alongside a poem, for instance, and then you learn to
Mhm.
deliver each line, part of the poem in a different passion, and it's almost as much about learning the transition between the passions as
Right.
the passions themselves, and that in
Mm.
a way dictates also the pacing of the delivery,
Oh,
and so
yeah.
it's a whole embodied practice.
Right.
Um,
So not just this, but it's kind of the way that, yeah, that's fascinating. I'd love
mm,
to, yeah, please send that on for me. I'd love
yeah,
to read more
absolutely.
about
Yeah,
that.
I can share that.
Yeah.
Anyone else like to jump in with a question? Asi in the chat, would you like to ask your question?
Hmm.
I know that people can't always get on the microphone in
Yeah.
these, so Asi asked about what journals are publishing on gesture related.
There is a
Uh,
journal. There is a journal called Gesture, actually. Hi, I see. And
Okay, thank
they
you.
do sometimes. They do sometimes. I mean, a lot of it is this more the contemporary gesticulation rather than the art of gesture. But I think I've seen some articles where people have talked about artistic forms or gesture that's part of a kind of artistic practice rather than rather than simply the kind of co-speech that we have now. So that's probably where I would look first to see. But then I think theatrical journals, various other, I think in my field, I think the Shakespeare. There's several journals that are quite interested in that as part of Shakespeare Bulletin, for instance, does performance practice, and that's so I think. I think those would also work as well. But I'd look at that if you're interested in the topic. I'd look at that journal.
Okay, thank you. That's because in the field of music, it seems to be a little bit like an ephemeral area, somehow falling between arts. Like music is somehow so solipsistic world, and not all the journals maybe accept gestural as a part of the music studies, but.
Yeah, and I think that sense of this is something that's kind of, like you said, ephemeral. That thing what I opened up with, this idea of how you capture these kinds of moments, and whether that's as I said, there is a lot of sense of this as a kind of outmoded practice. But I think the use of that in Baroque opera and other sorts of things is really really important. Really interesting. You bring those conversations together.
And by the way, thank you so much for the lecture. Very, very
thank you.
Fascinating topic.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Ooh, it's a long quote. Let's see.
Again, Matthew, if you'd like to ask your question out loud, that would be wonderful. If not, we can read it.
Yeah, hi. I have a really bad internet connection, so sorry about that. It might go off. Thank you. And I just wanted to get some more thoughts of yours, if you had any, about working with improvisation in music and how scores can be very prescriptive, I suppose. So I was thinking of ancient music, and in ancient Greece, there's like the philosophy of music is embedded in the everyday lives of the people there, and I certainly don't think of that music as being overly prescriptive. But I suppose it's an embedded kind of sacred music, I suppose. And then later we see the same kind of prescriptive but scriptive nature of the notation in contemporary compositions like Lachenmann. And I'm looking for somewhere kind of in between those two things in my compositions. Mostly, sorry.
Yeah. No, please go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to comment that Emily, you said that it was seen as a lazy thing, maybe to not have as much prescriptive notation. But then there's the other side to that, which is that it can be it can be under prescriptive. Yeah, it's a thin line to tread, really, when it comes to writing out, I suppose, instructions for performers that aren't too prescriptive. They are just the limitations that they can play against. And I just wondered if that's something that you'd thought about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's that dynamic is a really interesting one. I wrote a piece with Julie Cummings, who's a musicologist, on improvisation in music and theater in the early modern period. It's in one of those History of Distributed Cognition volumes that Edinburgh put out, and she's really interested in these in that kind of interplay between the prescriptive and the kind of improvisational, and particularly things like gracing and what it means to have this moment of, what it means to grace something with your, both musically. And I got interested in that as a way of thinking about, again, that question of how people imagined, how you'd assess a theatrical performance and how you assess whether something has been graced in the proper way. But I think, again, we're getting at that question of, what gets written down, what do people just kind of understand as part of the things that go without saying. And I think those are always the hardest things to discover sometimes in the past, because it's like, you write a contemporary novel and you don't really bother to explain like how the elevators work, right? You're not, it's just it's part of the things you sort of know. And so that gets, hard. And those are the things that get they get kind of lost, you think, because they're not written down, they're not there, but figuring out how that kind of tacit knowledge sort of operates is a really, it's a complex question. I thought that Stravinsky example is really interesting.
Yeah, I think that was about 1917, 1919 or something he said that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was thinking of that now you said that. I am very aware that the lack of information in a composition, not that mine will be preserved, I wouldn't have thought too much, but in future archaeologists may be looking through this, through my scores and think, oh, wow, there's no information here whatsoever.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you. Judith has a question about gender.
Yeah, thanks so much for this brilliant talk. I was curious about how gender was embodied, or if it was gesturally encoded, because especially in the historic context, I assume, obviously, because gender is not a stable concept that persists over time, what were ways in which these young boys, male actors played women beyond just, they wore a dress or something?
That's really, I mean, of course, that's something we'd love to know more about. I mean, so typically from what we understand, the boys were often apprenticed, sometimes formally, sometimes informally, to older actors. So Hemmings, who was a member of the company, he was a freeman of the grocer's company, which allowed him to apprentice people, and they didn't really scrutinize too much about whether you were actually learning to be a grocer or whether you were just had the right to make an apprentice contract. And so, there's a lot of debate about how these things get taught, but it seems to have been really part of the preparation process that the adult actor is taking the younger actor through the points. So if you think about, and through the various kinds of passions. So you think about Burbage as Romeo talking to Juliet as the apprentice. What are the so some of it would be through the writing and being able to kind of interpret the sort of the writing and the role of just what's in the parts for that. And yeah, movement. I mean, if you look at people who are doing some of the who worked at the Globe and trying. I mean, some of that gets a little, I think, overblown, perhaps. But the question of you talked about just getting up in a dress, but wearing a dress really makes you move very differently in this period. So one of it is how do you inhabit that kind of costume versus inhabiting a costume that has a sword or those kinds of things. So, and there's certain kind of conventions of movement. Servants, for instance, were known for running really fast, so there's certain kind of types that were sort of associated with particular ways of movement. We do, as I said, that I gave from the example of Desdemona sort of shows that at least at the time of watching something like that, the audience is saying, she was amazing, so there's not really that they're really referring to the kind of the gender of the character. So I think, there's a lot we don't know, but I think a lot of it is, through this kind of apprentice system, through the way the kind of the parts are written. And, I got to say one thing, Shakespeare really does write better parts for women than almost anybody in the period. I mean, Marlowe really is like, that's not where you want to go to think about how women, might be kind of realistically portrayed. Similar with Johnson, neither of them were good at that at all. They weren't interested, and so Shakespeare does seem to have been, there are other as well, Webster and Duchess Amalfi and so forth, but he does seem to have been interested in kind of writing these parts, more fully. So providing that kind of foundation for the gesture. But of course, we don't know. A lot of it's relatively speculative as well. But it's a great question.
Thank you. Yeah, I was curious because I assumed that this cross-dressing would not have been done in sort of a drag overblown way or a persiflage of women, especially when they're playing serious female roles like Desdemona or something. So do you think, though, that the passions themselves, because of this apprentice system, that they were not explicitly or implicitly gendered, but that the passions were somewhat stable in this specific context, and then it was just mapped onto the role.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, first part of your question, absolutely. You know, that you sometimes still see people thinking about these as being done in drag. And I think sometimes like some of the early work at the Globe where you've got, you know, Mark Rylance and others, you know, fully adult men performing these roles, I think sometimes gives a kind of skewed picture of what that might actually have looked like when you're talking about, you know, boys of 16 or 17. And one thing, just anecdotally, years when I was living in New Zealand, I was part of there was a Shakespeare Globe Center thing where all these students would perform scenes from Shakespeare, and there was a national festival in Queen's birthday weekend. And so you get these all boys schools, and some, you know, these kids would perform the female roles. And in the all boys schools, you could not get these boys to take that seriously. They were too afraid that, you know, if they really inhabited the role, that they would, you know, that somehow their masculinity would be kind of threatened. So that's often a kind of view that you get. Now, yeah, it's a question of whether I really like that question of, you know, whether we can think about the emotions or the passions, are they same or different? I mean, there's a lot, you know, for instance, I guess a big exception to my Marlowe disc just now would have been like some of the Orchid, you know, thinking about the women and passion and madness. That was another thing that, you know, so it's a slight, I think the madness gets written for women a little bit differently than madness for men. So that would be a fun place to kind of go and look and see, you know, how that gender works. That's probably where I would go to think about that question rather than just the romance, but think about, is there a specific kind of um, way of writing madness passion for women versus men in this period? I think there might be, but I haven't fully worked that out. It's a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah, that whole, I was thinking while you were talking, the fact that Shakespeare writes more complex female roles than most of his contemporaries, does that suggest therefore that either he had access to more accomplished boy actors, or perhaps that his company was a more attractive place to apprentice, because for the young boys there's the possibility of these quite substantial roles?
Yeah, it's probably somewhat circular in that sense when you say, you know, that you get, you know, and you can kind of see, you know, I mean, if you just think about the way he develops a role, you know, a role like Cleopatra, right? Where where he deliberately calls attention to the artifice when the young actor playing Cleopatra complains that she might be, or he might be, um, made to squeak, what's it, a boy squeaking out or something like that. There's this kind of meta theatrical sense of that. And sometimes that gets viewed as, you know, he's just bearing the device, but I think or sending it up. But I think it also shows a kind of confidence, I think, in that um, in that tradition. And the other thing is, you know, the other thing about Shakespeare, you know, it's different than Marlowe in particular. You know, he wrote so many different kinds of genres as well, and wrote over a longer period of time. So there's more scope for different kinds of roles. I mean, if you look at him more in the, you know, early period, there are all these history roles. They're not, you know, you get Margaret and some of these great roles, but they're not. They feel like they're more kind of drag roles, almost some of the early ones, rather than you know, than some of the more fully embodied female roles that you get a little later on.
And presumably also we need to consider what it was to be a prepubescent male actor at this point, because if it's certainly by the turn of the 18th century that people are talking about in relation to boy choristers, puberty happening much later than it does now, so late teens.
Yeah.
So boy actors could actually possibly have been in their mid-teens potentially.
Yeah, I think they would have been. They could have been up until, you know, if they weren't, if they didn't have to sing, the importance of their voice breaking is not that, you know, it's not as vital as it is in kind of music. And there's a funny moment in Twelfth Night, for instance, where Viola says that at one point she says, I will be you know, when she's deciding to disguise herself to get into the court of Orsino, she says, oh, I'll be a eunuch and I can sing. and then she never sings. The character never sings. And at one point, there's even a moment where um, it's almost like feels like it's sent up because Orsina says, who is it that sang that great song? And it looks like a setup for Viola to sing. And someone said, oh, he's not here. We'll have to bring him in. So they clearly seem to be writing for an actor who, especially because this is a breeches role where you're moving in between, the male and female. Probably at the point where either he never had a voice or the voice is broken, but it's still, he might be 17, 18, 19. You think of our own students, some of them, they're mature, but they still, could very much portray, some of them could portray this kind of role successfully, not necessarily from the perspective of just the musical performance that you get. And again, you're right, the choristers, boys in the chorus seem to be younger generally and were chosen for their ability to sing. And that's a bit different than what's happening in the adult apprentice system in our period.
It is, yeah. Well, but the parallel I was thinking of was that in Bach's choirs, for instance, in the early 18th century, you still had boy trebles who were 16, 17 years old because their voices hadn't broken. So yeah. And I was also thinking just in terms of the notion of the invention of childhood in the 19th century, and actually, isn't it interesting actually that in a way that sort of because again the parallel in music is that you would have accessists, you would have apprentices in orchestras, 18th through into the 19th century, and at a certain point where for all sorts of very widespread reasons you start to get the emergence of formalized education, and education which then becomes separated from professional practice. And at the same time it's this emergence of the idea of childhood as a separate developmental stage, and I guess it doesn't make sense to apply that to this period actually, because that's a later concept. So
I think that's probably right.
Assuming that boy actors were emotionally less mature, that goes along with that concept, and maybe it's not.
Yeah, that's and I think that's absolutely right. Thinking about the kind of the way, a childhood's conceived of, and what it means to kind of move into this sort of adult world through this apprenticeship is, I think, really is really kind of historically constrained in many ways.
We have just one last question we have time for from Assi. Yeah.
Well, I think the best example would be best example would be Hamlet going, do not saw the air, with your hands thus. And Paul Minzer has this great article about that, where the thus would always be referring, if you see this play being done now, it's always referring to the early, whatever the earlier performance tradition that you're defining yourself against is. So, so there is Hamlet is making fun of it. Now, the other thing about that scene is that another way of reading Hamlet's advice to the players is that this is kind of young, rich, entitled man telling professional actors what to do, and this kind of fanboy sort of, I've thought of all these great things that you might get, and so that you can kind of read it in so both directions. But yeah, that is part of, I think that's kind of built in, that idea of not, and there are some jokes about, for instance, there's that excellent actor, a common player is somebody who, instead of talking directly to someone on stage, puts their voice out like this so that everybody will pay attention to him. So there were certain ways of inhabiting roles that were and that were definitely satirized in this period. Yeah.
May you mention the articles' names once more? I didn't catch it.
I can't, the author is Paul Minzer, and I think the title is called That Old Saw. It's in a book collection. If you can't find it, let me know. I'll be able to send you the reference.
How do you spell it? Sorry.
Sorry. Paul is Minzer, Menzer. And I believe the first part of the title is That Old Saw, SAW. Like
okay.
Sawing your hands, but also this idea of a shtick. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're at time, although I think we could happily go on chatting about this for quite a lot longer into the evening. But in the interests of not keeping everyone hostage, I think we will wrap up there. So I can say a really huge thank you to Evelyn for such a fascinating talk and discussion.
Thanks. You were a great audience. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.